Hey, hello friends, and welcome to Retro Portal Studio. And in this video we're going to be taking a look at creating this frosted glass look in Flutter. It is a bit performance intensive, but it sure does look cool. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so right now I'm in a simple Flutter app that just has this my home page, which is a stateless widget. In the build function of my home page, I have a scaffold which is wrapped in a safe area, and for the body of the scaffold I have this container which is decorated using a box decoration. Now in the box decoration, you can see that I have an image that is a decoration image, and in this I'm passing an image that I have in the assets of the app, and for the fit I'm having the box fit of cover so that the image covers the entire container. If I run the app at this point, it looks something like this. I'll minimize the emulator for now. So let's take a look at the assets that I already have in the application. In the application folder, you can see that I have a folder called assets, in which I have a folder called images, and in this I have two images called design.jpg, which you just saw in the emulator as the background of the container, and the second image is the noise.png, which we'll use later on in the tutorial. And I've also declared these assets in the pubspec.yaml file under the assets section. Back to the main.dart file. The first thing that we'll do here is just below my homepage, we'll create a new stateless widget and name this frosted glass box. And we'll add this widget as the child property of the container in my home page. Coming to the frosted glass box, we have to add a few properties which will be required by this box, such as a width and height, which are going to be double. Other than these, we'll also add a child property so that we can add the text that we want to show inside the frosted glass box. And this child property is going to be of type widget, so that we can add column, row, or any other type of layout that we want for the frosted glass box. To create a constructor with these properties, I'll click on any of them and click on Alt-Enter on Android Studio and create constructor for final fields. With this, we have a constructor with all these fields and we can mark each of them as required. Once this is done, let's take a look at creating the build function of this frosted glass box. Now at this point, we're returning a container, and to give a size to this container, we need to pass in the width and height that we receive in the constructor. For the child of this container, we'll pass in a stack, because we'll be adding different layers of effects on top of each other to give it a frosted glass look. I'll add the children property to the stack, and for now, in this children property, I'll only add a container. Now before doing any further changes, I'll bring back the emulator so that we can watch the changes in real time. Now the first thing that I'll do is that in the container, I'll add the decoration property, and in this box decoration, the very first thing that we need to do is we need to add a gradient. And for this gradient property, we'll pass in a linear gradient. The reason to add this gradient is because to have a realistic glass look, we want to have a source of lighting. And in this case, we want the light to come in from the top left corner, because of which we want this portion to have a whitish tone. And coming down to the bottom right corner, this whitish tone will fade away and hence we'll have a transparent look. So to come from a whitish tone to a transparent look, we want to have a linear gradient that moves from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. Coming back to the app, for the linear gradient, we'll pass in the begin property, and for this begin property, as I showed you, we need to pass in an alignment of top left. And for the end, we'll pass in an alignment of bottom right. Along with this, we'll also pass in the colors property. For the first color, that is for the top left corner, I'll pass in colors.white. And we don't want this white to be completely opaque, so we'll use with opacity. And for the opacity, I'll use 0.5, that is 50% of opacity. For the second color, we can pass in colors.transparent, but realistically speaking, as the light enters the top left corner of the glass, it won't completely vanish reaching to the bottom right. So instead, we want to have a white, but with even lower opacity. For this, I'll again use with opacity, and in this case, I'll pass in 0.2. Now the last property that remains with the linear gradient is the property of stops. And this property will take in a list of doubles, and the length of this list should match the length of the colors. So for the first value in the list of stops, I'll pass in 0.0. And the reason for passing this 0.0 is because we want the first color to start at the very top left. And for the second value, I'll pass in 1.0 because we want the second color to be at the very bottom right. And in between, there will be a transitional gradient. At this point, to see how it looks, we'll run the app. And as soon as the app runs, you can see that the whole screen is filled with the white gradient. The reason for this is because we have not passed any width and height to the frosted glass box. Now we want this box to be square. For this, what I'll do is I'll come up in the build function, and here I'll create a new size variable and name this size and put it equal to media query dot of context dot size. And once we get the size, I'll create a new double and name this container width and put it equal to size.width into 0.90. That is 90% of the width. Now since we want this to be a square, I'll pass in the same value for the width and height. Along with these, I also need to pass in a child property. We'll take a look at it later on, so for now, I'll pass in a center widget. At this point, if I save the app, you can see that this container takes the width and height that is required by its child, and hence the rest of the app is white. One way to solve this problem is to give a width and height to this container so that the container takes the width and height of the screen, and the other way is to wrap the frosted glass box with a center widget. With this, the container will take the size of the screen, and in the center we'll have the frosted glass box. I'll save the app, and with this we have the box in the center of the screen. Coming back to the glass box, the next thing that we need to do is we need to round the corners of this box. For this, I'll come back to the box decoration of the container, and in this I'll add the property of border radius. For this, I'll use border radius dot circular, and in this I'll pass in the radius of 20.0. Now to give it a bit of a glass look, we need to use the backdrop filter. For this, I'll come above container, and as the first child of the stack, I'll add the backdrop filter. And for the filter, I'll use image filter dot blur, and in this we need to pass in a value for sigma x and sigma y. Now the purpose of this sigma x and sigma y is a bit technical, so in simple words, with increased value, the blurriness increases. And also, for the backdrop filter to work, we also need to pass in the child property. And for this, I'll pass in a container. And for the container, I'll pass in a width of width and a height of height. These are the width and height values that we get in the constructor. Now for the container, I'll also need to pass in a child property. For this, I'll pass in a simple text. And for the text, I'll pass in a space. At this point, I'll save the app. And you can see that we have the blur. But instead of blurring only the frosted glass box, the blur appears on complete app screen. Now to contain this blur only to the frosted glass box, what I'll do is I'll wrap the container with a clip or rect. And in this we need to pass in the border radius. And for this I'll use border radius dot circular, and for the radius I'll pass in 20.0. And because we're using the same radius in the container for the second child, what I'll do is I'll cut this from here and go above the frosted glass box. And here I'll create a new final and name this border radius and put this equal to the same value. And instead of passing this complete value, I'll use border radius and pass in for the clip or rect and also for the container's box decoration. I'll save the app, and with this you can see that the blur is now contained to the frosted glass box. Now since this is a glass, it has to have a border. And to add that, what we can simply do is we can come down to this box decoration and add a new property of border. And for this, we can pass in border.all. And for the color, I can pass in colors.white, .with opacity. And for the opacity, I can pass in 0.2. Along with this, we also have to pass in a width. And I'll keep the width at minimum by passing in the value of 1.0. At this point, I'll save the app. This is a small difference and it might not be visible in the video, but it adds to the realism of the frosted glass look. One more thing that we can do to add to the realism is add the box shadow property for the box decoration. In this, we need to pass in a list of box shadows. So for the first entry in this list, I'll pass in an instance of box shadow. And for this, I'll pass in the color of colors.black with an opacity of 0.25. Along with this, I'll also pass in the blur radius of approximately 30. And you might not be able to notice the difference here, but it does add to the realism of the glass. Now the biggest thing missing in this frosted glass look is the noise, because a real life frosted glass looks something like this. Now creating this type of detailed noise can be a bit tricky, so let's take a look at what we're gonna do. Now in the app we have this noise.png, which looks something like the static that we used to get on the television. We can use this to add a noisy look to the glass that we're trying to create. I'll go back to the main.dart file, and in this, right between the backdrop filter and the container, I'll add a new image widget, and I'll use image.assets, and in this I'll pass in the path for the noise.png, which is assets/images/noise.png. And since we need the image to fill in the width and height of the box, I'll pass in the width and height to the image widget. Now I'll bring back the emulator, At this point, you can see that even after passing the width and height, the dimensions of the noise image does not fit in the box. So what we can do is we can also pass in the property of fit, and for this we can pass in box fit dot cover. And now the noise covers the entire box. Now we need to reduce the opacity of this noise. For this, I'll wrap this image with an opacity widget, and for the opacity, I'll pass in a value of 0.15. With this, we have a good amount of noise in the glass, which adds to the frosty look. I'll increase the opacity of the image just to add to the noise. I'll make it 0.20, and now we have a realistic looking frosted glass look in the application. You can tweak all these settings to make them fit your taste, but for the purpose of this tutorial, these settings work just fine. The only thing that's left to do now is to add the text to this glass box. For this, I'll come up in my home page, and in the child of the frosted glass box, as the child of the center, I'll pass in a column. And in the column widget, I'll pass in the children property. And for the first child, I'll pass in a simple text that says Retro Portal Studio. Now for the style of the text, I'll pass in a text style. And in the text style, I'll pass in the property of color. Now it's the color of the text that'll make it look like it's engraved on the glass. So for this, I'll pass in colors.white, and I'll give it an opacity using with opacity and a value of 0.4. I'll save the app, but you can see that nothing appears on the screen. The reason for this is that in the frosted glass look widget, we have not done anything with the child. What we need to do is we need to come down to the container, and we need to pass in the child as the child property of the container. With this, I'll save the app, and you can see that the text of Retro Portal Studio appears in the frosted glass box. I'll come up in my home page, and for the text style, I'll pass another property of font size, and I'll keep the font size to approximately 32. And for this text, I'll also add a font weight, and I'll keep this font weight.bold. I'll save the app, and to bring the text in the center, what I'll do is I'll add the property of main axis alignment to the column, and set it to main axis alignment.center. Now for the second child of the column, I'll pass in a divider, and I need to set the color of the divider to the same color. So what I'll do is I'll take the color from here, and just above my home page, I'll create a new final variable, and I'll name this text color, and I'll put this equal to the color value. Now instead of passing in the whole thing, what I'll do is I'll pass in the text color instead. I'll use the same for the divider. At this point, you can see that the divider covers the entire width of the box. So what I can do is I can pass in the indent property and pass in an indent of 40. With this, you can see that the divider leaves a space of 40 points at its start, and if I pass in the property of end indent and give it a value of 40, the divider also leaves a space of 40 points at the end. I'll copy this text from here, and I'll also add a copy of this below the divider. With the second copy, I'll change the font size to 20, and I'll remove the font weight. And for the text, I'll pass in frosted glass. Now when I save the app, you can see that it appears that the text is engraved on the glass. With this, we have created a frosted glass card, and there's a lot more you can do with this. I hope you learned a lot in this tutorial, and if you do, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, and also consider following me on Twitter for future updates. See you next time. Peace!